Hello, my fellow introverts. Stacy here, your programming and test automation expert. So today we're going to use decorators to be able to spread function arguments. I will describe why we exactly need to do that because usually you don't need to do such things, but I will give you a certain scope of a problem that you might stumble with the way I did, and I will show you one solution that can be useful in this case. So we will start in a moment, but before that, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and check the links in the description where you will find today's video code, our upcoming courses, as well as a link to help Ukraine. And now let's get on with it. To start with, let's understand what the heck it means to spread the arguments of a function and why do you exactly need it. So basically, there might be situations when you have a function or a method and an argument is being injected through a decorator or some other way into this function. And you have no idea what this object is. And well, you might disagree with me and say, come on, I can find this object and I can just use type annotations to select its type and I will know what it is. But this might not be exactly the case, whereas you would know the type, but you wouldn't know which exact attributes it will have on it because they might be created dynamically. They might be attached to this object dynamically and you wouldn't know where it happened and what is exactly stored there. So there is not many things you can do with this, especially if this is a framework and you cannot refactor this code, then you have to find a solution to do something with it. So the solution that I'm going to propose you today, it's not the only one that you can use, of course, but this one is about spreading the arguments. What does it mean? You have your function and it receives this object. You cannot handle this any other way, but instead of receiving the object, you're going to specify which arguments you are expecting to be injected into this function. And we're going to write a decorator which is going to fix this problem, and you will see that this might be of use for you. At least I hope so. So let's go to the code and simulate the problem and see how we can handle it. And I am going to do this now, but I don't recommend you doing something like this in a real project. If you have a library that behaves this way, well, we have to deal with it. We cannot modify the library usually, right? But if you actually write a brand new project or you have to make a decision to write something like this, I don't recommend you doing so because I personally don't like this approach. The approach itself is okay, but you have to do it a bit differently. So anyway, basically, what we need, first of all, we need a class that is going to represent our object that is going to be injected in different functions and going to be updated dynamically. So let's create this class. It's going to be called context. I'm calling it the same way as it's being called in Behave Python library. If you ever used it, then you know what I'm talking about. So, but anyway, I'm going to explain what's happening here. We have the class context. We're going to put a pass here. We don't need anything here. And now let's create a decorator that is going to inject the object of this class into our functions. We need, first of all, we can call it with context, right? And now, of course, we pass in function here, and we will have a wrapper inside with args, quarks. And now we need to pass here the object of this class. I'm going to create the object here. If you're using a library, you are going to have one single object for all of your functions, and this is what we want to achieve. So there are two ways. One way is just to create a variable called context and create an object and use this object within this file. This is okay for us because we don't have multiple files, so we can just rely on this one. But in ideal scenario, maybe you would need a singleton. But let's not spend time on this today. So we will just create variable Let's call it context object, and we're going to create the object of context. Okay, so now we need to use this object in our with context decorator. So we're going to do func context object args quarks. And of course, we need to return the function and return the wrapper. All right. So we are good to go with this decorator. Now we need a function that is going to create something. Let's do two functions. Let's imagine that we're writing some kind of a server and we have a configuration first being done. So we actually read some configuration, we define it, and we put it into this context object. So let's start with this one. So we are going to use our with context decorator, and we're going to create a function that is called configure. And inside of this function, let's do something like, we need to inject the context here, right? Because it is going to be our first argument, because we use the decorator and here it is the first argument. So it's going to inject context into our function arguments. And we are going to do context dot, let's say, host equals, let's say, and let's say that it's, we can just leave it this way. And we're going to have context port, and it's going to be 8080. Okay, so we have our first configure function. And we need a second function, which is going to be forming our URL. So let's do with context, def form URL. And here we, of course, have to put the context. And then we can give it an endpoint. Okay. And what we're going to do, we're going just to return HTTPS. We're going to put in context.host, context.port, and endpoint name. Something like that. Let's test it and see what happens. So first of all, we call the configure because we have to configure, we have to have the host and port in our context. And then we will do form URL. Let's say it's going to be users, and we're going to make a print. Okay, let's run it. Works. So what is the problem here? Because, well, it looked quite nice right now. We could see the type hints that we had, the host and the port. So everything looked quite pleasant and nice. So what is the problem? Imagine that you have this with context defined somewhere in the library, and the context is being just automatically put into your functions. So in this case, you wouldn't see the helpers in PyCharm. You could have used a type annotation, right? So you could have done something like this. But if you look closely into our context, we don't have anything there. We are adding these values dynamically. So we have no idea what exactly is stored in the context. So we would have to run it in a debugger and understand what is happening there. And sometimes this might be very inconvenient, so we would have to go to the prints and, well, there is a better solution for this. So this is what I'm going to show you right now. Okay, so let's fix this issue. And first of all, let's think how it's going to look like. As you can see, this function, it uses context inside of it. So we are retrieving host and port from context, which is also maybe not the best ideal situation because we are caring about this context to be injected, and we could have done it the other way. The function itself shouldn't care what is context, right? It should just do its thing. So ideally, we would have to just do host and port here without any context, just host and a port. I hope you agree with me that this looks better than some context. So what we are going to do here is we're going to write another decorator that is going to spread the stuff from the context, but we don't need all of the stuff from the context because there might be a situation that we also have like context db name here, right? Because it might be also in the configuration. So we would call it. And then we will not need the DB name. So if we just spread everything from context, then of course this function is going to fail when we call it because it's going to receive an unexpected argument, a DB name. So we have to somehow understand how exactly we can see that this particular function expects a host and a port, right? And of course the endpoint name, but we don't care about this. So let's start writing it. I will explain it on the way. So let's call it, I would say, spread context func. Okay, so we have our template for the decorator, and now we can do something with it. We know that context is always the first argument, so we could have done something like this, args and quarks, right? And we will, of course, do something with it before proceeding. So this is one of the solutions. If you are not sure or you want to have some additional verification, then you could leave it as is, I mean without the context, just like that, and check whether one of the arguments is context by its type, for example. But let's start with the simple way, just putting context here. So now the question comes, how the heck do we understand that this function that expects host and port expects host and port in our decorator? So to understand that, we're going to use a marvelous library of Python, which is called inspect. So let's import it, first of all. Inspect, right? And now we're going to use it inside of our decorator. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here. Let's run it in debugger. And let's see what we can do with our function using inspect. So what we're going to do inspect dot signature func, and we see some stuff here. We have empty, we have parameters, and we have return annotation. So parameters, what is going to interest us this time? So we can just do dot parameters. Inside of parameters, you can see that we have an ordered dict, which is containing host, port, and endpoint name. Kind of looks similar to what we had here, right? So these are the arguments, and we can actually understand what this function is going to expect. What we can do, we could do inspect signature func parameters, right? And we can just get the keys from these parameters because we need just the names. We are going to create a new variable. Let's call it expected arguments. Right? So we have our keys here. And now we have to retrieve them from our context, which we're going to do with getUtter function. Let's do for arg in expected arguments. GetUtter context arg. And of course, we have to somehow pass them into our function. So let's create a list. Actual arguments, let's say. Actual arguments append. And let's see what it does. What does it collect and if it works at all. So let's run it. Okay, it seems that we got an error, so let's see what happens. So we currently have arg endpoint name. Let's try to get an attribute from context, which is going to be our endpoint name. And of course, we don't have this argument. So we have to somehow first check whether our context has this argument or not. Otherwise, we're going to fail and you see the result. So this is not going to work. So what is missing here is if has utter context arg, then we do something like this, the actual arguments here first of all, and then the args and the quarks, right? So let's try to run it. Now it should work. Let's just verify that we have the actual arguments. So as you can see, we have our actual arguments as a list, and we will have to spread them as well, the same we did with the args. So let's do that, and I think we're good to go. Let's try it out. I will remove the breakpoint, and let's try to run it. Okay. And it works. So this is the way you can actually spread the arguments. Basically, of course, you can modify it further and add some more configuration here. So this is how you can easily fix such stuff. All right, my fellow introverts, it's time to wrap it up for today and let's make a quick summary of what we have learned. There are some nasty frameworks that actually like to inject some objects which are dynamically updated all over throughout your code, and you have no idea what is stored there at the moment when you try to use these objects. So an idea here is to create a decorator that is going to spread and adjust the values from this object for your function based on these function's arguments. So if a function expects a host and a port, then you just get the host and the port from the context and you put it as function arguments. And this is how you deal with it. Of course, the solution that we have discussed has its drawbacks because you might not be prepared for some situations and sometimes some extra error handling might be in place, but you get the idea, so you can take it as a template and develop it further for your exact means. So this is it for today. I hope you liked today's content. Don't forget to check out the links in the description so you can just copy this code, and don't forget about Help for Ukraine. And well, I wish you a very happy coding and I will see you in 1 week. You wouldn't exactly know which arguments, you wouldn't exactly know which parameters my functions where I was using my framework. Okay, so what are we going to do now?